Today we have two topics on the agenda. First item is the November 2008 investment report. Following that is a new report, which we'll be looking at the comparative indicators report for the city. So let's start off with the investment report. Mr. Pearson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director, and as you said, Mr. Chair, it's the investment report for the month as of November 30th, 2008, so through 5 months of the fiscal year. And I'll just give you a brief overview, starting with the page 1 of the attachment, which is the activity and interest report for November 30th, 2008. And we'll start with the left-hand side of the schedule, which shows the purchases and, well, the investment activity, including purchases or deposits at the top, and then the sales maturities, calls, or withdrawals at the bottom. And you can see that during the month of November, we really were not active in the investment market. In fact, the only transaction that we made other than LAIF deposits was a renewal of a $2 million certificate of deposit with Montecito Bank and Trust. That's a CD that we've had now for, I want to say, about 6 or 7 years at the same level, $2 million. And Montecito Bank and Trust was able to give us a very competitive rate on that, so we did renew it for a 1-year period of time. So that was the only purchase that we made. During the month of November, we did have well, you see the same maturity for the previous Montecito Bank and Trust certificate of deposit there. Other than that, we had 3 securities that either matured or were called. 2 of them were called and 1 matured. And then we had 2 LAIF withdrawals during the month as well. So in total, the activity was a decline in the investment portfolio of $1.6 million, which simply meant our cash balance was that a little bit higher. On the right-hand side, you see the investment income that we earned during the month on our pooled investments, including interest on our banking account, our checking account. Total of about $542,000, and the redevelopment agency on their LAIF balance earned about $35,000. So during the month of November, we earned $577,000 of interest. Page 2 of the attachment report, the summary of cash and investments, as usual, shows you 2 snapshots. One at the reporting date of November 30th. And at the top half of the page, it shows you the same snapshot from the prior month, October 31st. You can see there the decline in the net cash and investment activity for November of about $1.1 million. You can also see that because we were not in the market in terms of purchasing securities, that because the portfolio was 1 month older, if you will, that the average days to maturity declined by about 36 days. Part of that is attributable to the fact that the LAIF balances were up approximately $5 million. And as you know, LAIF is a 1-day days to maturity, and so it has a significant impact on the total portfolio average days to maturity. As you can see, in November 30th, it was about 20.6% of the portfolio, whereas a month earlier, at October 31st, it was about 17.75% of the portfolio. Really, that's about all I have to report. Pretty much a stable month in our portfolio. As we know, interest rates since that time, since November 30th, have further declined with the Fed's unprecedented 0.75% rate cut last week, setting the Fed funds rate in a range from 0 to 0.25% and letting it be known that it would sit there somewhat indefinitely, at least for the foreseeable future. So clearly the investment environment that we're in now in terms of investment income earning potential is substantially lower than it's been for quite some time.
Could you discuss a little bit the way that LAIF works in terms of its composition and the how that looks in the economic environment that we see ourselves in?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. LAIF, as you know, stands for the Local Agency Investment Fund. It is a money market fund which is run by the State Treasurer's Office. It is actually a piece of a much larger money market fund run by the State Treasurer's Office, which is called PMIA, or the Pooled Money Investment Account, which is essentially the state's own short-term cash management money market account in which they invest whatever little cash they have left. And LAIF is a piece of that. LAIF is available to all local governments, whether they be special districts or cities, to invest their overnight money in, and it's managed pretty much like a trust account. It's not always the case, but in the wake of the Orange County bankruptcy in '95, and then in the wake of the dot-com bust when the state was having budget difficulties as well, there was some concern over the security of the city's monies in LAIF, not because of an investment risk, but simply because were they protected from the state freezing them. In one case, when the state didn't adopt the budget until September, those monies were frozen, because that's what happens when the state doesn't adopt a budget on time. But subsequent to that, legislation was passed which exempted LAIF from any sorts of impacts from state budget crises. And so we are fully protected there. It is a money market account. It is very short-term and liquid. I think the average days to maturity is somewhat less than 180 days, 6 months. And so we have seen our LAIF interest rate drop pretty dramatically, and we expect that it will continue to do so. But the good news is that we keep getting emails from the state treasurer's office reminding us about how secure our investment is and how we don't have to worry about it getting caught up in the state budget difficulties.
That's kind of where I was wanted to take that discussion. This morning, the news is full of highway projects being put on hold in the state, and so there is now legislation which limits the impact of the governor or the state legislature on the LAIF. Is that the case?
That is the case. In fact, the legislation essentially, I don't think it used these exact words, but it essentially established that LAIF is a trust account where those monies that are deposited in LAIF are held solely and exclusively for the benefit of the public agencies, local governments that put the money there. And so they can't touch that money, nor is it at risk for being frozen as a result of the state cash flow difficulties.
Okay. One further question? Ms.
Thank
Mayor?
you. Page 5, I know later today we have a big item about the airport, and just wanted to highlight the maturity date of this promissory note being 1/109, and just reassuring in case people watch this and not the others that that's being taken care of, or if you want to expand on that.
Right. That,
today.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, that's right. And the first item on your administrative agenda is the full council this afternoon is a major item on the airport terminal project, the financing of it. And one of the actions that we are recommending to council is an amendment to this promissory note, which will extend the maturity date to June 30th, 2009. That has, as you know, become necessary as a result of the credit market freeze-up, which has delayed our issuance of our airport revenue bonds to finance all the improvements out at the airport, including the main terminal project. And so we will be asking you this afternoon to approve an amendment to that promissory note, which extends it to June 30, 2009, by which time we feel fairly confident that we will be able to retire that promissory note with the proceeds of long-term debt issued to finance the entire project, including the joint use rental car facility that this promissory note has financed.
Thank you.
Okay, is there a motion?
Sure, I'll move this to council.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right. Now then, we're going to move to the comparative indicators report, which is a new report for this committee and for the city as a whole. It's a report that I've been interested in and working with Mr. Armstrong on for the past several years. And I'm very happy to see it here today, and Lori is going to help explain it to us.
Good afternoon. My name's Lori Peterson, and I'm an administrative analyst in the City Administrator's Office. And I'm going to present the Comparative Indicators Report for this year. Originally, similar type report was made in 2006 and 2007. Pardon me. With 5 similar sized cities. And so with this version, what we've done is we've expanded the number of cities to be 10, including ourselves would be 11. And they're mostly coastal communities that have similar types of focus as the community of Santa Barbara. Because the populations now vary a great deal, we've also presented some of the information in a per capita so that you can look at it at a finer detail. The 10 cities that we selected were Santa Cruz, Redondo Beach, Newport Beach, Santa Monica, Carlsbad, Berkeley, the city of Ventura, Sunnyvale, Oceanside, and Huntington Beach. And like I said, most of these are coastal communities. Sunnyvale is the one exception, but they had some good data that we could look at. The indicators that we looked at for this report are the demographics, the general fund revenues and expenditures, redevelopment agency monies, public safety, staffing, and public services. To lead off with the demographics, we looked at the land area of each city. I was able to get the population base from the Department of Finance for the state of California. They do an annual projection, and so I used that number for the population. And then we also looked at population per square mile to kind of look at the density of each of these communities. This is just a chart showing the variety, the range of land area that we're looking at. We have as small as 6 square miles with the city of Redondo Beach, and then as large as 42 square miles with Carlsbad and Oceanside. Population-wise, we go from about 55,000 people in Santa Cruz to Huntington Beach, which is almost 200,000 people. And we fall really fairly close to the median on that one in this range of cities that we're looking at. When you look at density, the smaller communities definitely have significant densities in their communities, whereas when you go out to Carlsbad and Oceanside, their density levels are much less. Santa Barbara is down there on the left-hand side at about 4,300. Pardon me. The next area we looked at information had to do with the population characteristics, median income, median household income, and owner-occupied housing. And all of this data is from 2006, the survey data that the Census Bureau maintains and updates in varying years. There is one city, and I have it noted in the future, Santa Cruz. Their data is only for 2000. They weren't part of the 2006 survey. So for population characteristics, we looked at 19 years old and under is how the census gathers their information, and then over 65. And these are kind of just two extreme populations that may require special services or, youth programs, senior assistance, elements like that might impact a community and the kinds of funding choices that they make. Oceanside has the highest percentage of youth at 29%, and Newport Beach has the highest percentage over 65 at 20%. So again, just a varying range of population. Median income per capita and median household income. We put these up next to each other. Again, you kind of have to look at this data and then look at the communities and what's going on around there. Santa Cruz, fairly low down there, but also a high college population most likely impacts that information and the income, whereas Newport Beach with a larger retirement community have more affluent.
Lori, I've got a question here. Just as you said, to compare the data and just these last two slides. So taking Oceanside in the population characteristic and then comparing it to I'm sorry. It's Newport Beach, where's Newport Beach? Oh, okay. No, I guess the question was that although a population such as the elderly, 65 and older, may comprise a small percentage of the overall population, or at least in the two populations you looked at, the amount of income could far outweigh some of the other cities that have a larger population of older
Right.
folks. So it really is important to really layer these two on top of each other.
Really look at it, and you probably need a couple more elements even before you start to really say that you can make a connection between things.
Great, thank you.
In the financial area, we looked at the general fund revenue and then broke it down per capita and also the general fund expense. And these were from their 2008 adopted budget documents. You have Redondo Beach down on the far left-hand side at almost 70 million and Santa Monica at 246 million on the right-hand side. And it just kind of reflects the varying amount of revenue that are coming into each city. And in order to, again, kind of dig a little deeper, you start to look at per capita, but you still see that Santa Monica is way out on the right-hand side in comparison to everyone else. And Santa Barbara's right in the median in the amount of revenue per capita. And general fund expense, because oftentimes in these communities, when looking at them, they've pretty much mirrored what their income was. So I didn't break it down per capita, but this is what it looks like for them as well. Another way to look at the community's financial resources and how they're choosing to invest their money is to look at the percent of the money of the general fund that they invest back in the community infrastructure, which we had our whole infrastructure financing task force look at. But here's some very interesting information, I think, because communities really have a wide variety of policies about how they deal with investing in their infrastructure. Sunnyvale, according to their budget documents, has very little that they invest of their general fund money into their infrastructure, whereas Newport Beach out on the right-hand side is almost $11 million. Some of that for this snapshot could be projects that they picked in that year, and so it may weight it out a little bit, not having detail from one year to the next, but really focusing on this year.
Question, please, Lori.
Yeah.
Well, and this goes to the infrastructure task force. As I remember their recommendation, it's for the city to get up to 10% of the general fund budget on capital. Is that correct? As I remember, which none of these comparable, I mean, it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind as we look at that recommendation that even Newport Beach, which is an outlier, is at 8.4% in that particular year. So.
Right.
I don't know if others, like you said, in other years might have done other things,
Right.
or if there's a weighted average over the course of 5 years or something that to look at the percentage of the general fund budget on capital projects.
Right.
But we might want to look at that.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, I think I would just add to that, however, that I think that for the most part, if the consensus is that that sort of statewide or even nationwide, very few cities are investing enough in their infrastructure. So even a city that's investing 7 or 8%, I don't know that I would translate that into a premise that that's an adequate amount.
That's not what I meant.
I
but
know,
yeah.
and I know it wasn't,
Yeah.
but I also wanted to make the point for people who might be listening. I know that isn't what you meant, but I think that it really is a community by community metric that depends on the amount of infrastructure and assets that a community has to maintain and improve.
We have a speaker.
You've
And let
awoken
me-
the bear.
And let me also make it even more confusing, and that is you really need to bore into a city. For example, in Santa Barbara, we take half of our utility tax, and instead of putting it in the general fund, we put it into streets. Now, you could put it into the general fund, then do capital out of the general fund and call it capital.
Right.
And so you really need to bore down. The city of Sunnyvale is famous for having lots of socks. And so what they do is they charge their departments, they put the money in the SOX, and then they spend the money out of the SOX. And so when you look at Sunnyvale and say, boy, they hardly spend anything there, they could have a lot of money in special funds that they've pulled out and charged their departments. And so this one, it's an interesting one, but to really use it as kind of a metric, you would probably need to bore into each one of these cities and find out how they do business. Just like in Santa Barbara, you know, if you bore down in ours and looked at the utility tax, you could change that number by 3 or 4%.
Ms. Oconee?
Question, Mr. Armstrong. You got up. The first thing is, would you give a lay explanation of SOX, please?
Special.
It's not little things in
internal
drawers, or maybe it is.
Special little internal service funds that you choose. For another example for us is a lot of cities would show in capital vehicle equipment, like fire trucks and things like that. We used to show that. And we now collect a little money from all of the departments for the replacement of capital equipment, and then we buy that out of our fleet replacement fund. And that doesn't show up here as a capital replacement cost because it's paid for out of the vehicle replacement fund. But in a given year, the departments probably, general fund departments probably, Bob, $1.5 million in for vehicle replacement per year. So again, that's the way where you take the money out, you charge it, you expense it out as depreciation or reserve for replacement, and then you pay for it out of another fund that's not in the general fund.
And just to be clear, it's not, these are not hidden or in any way funds that are diverted in a way that isn't transparent to the public. I mean, when you say SOX, people think of, you stuff a little money in a sock and you put it in a drawer and nobody sees it again, kind of thing.
No, it's all above board. It's just different ways of doing business in different cities. When you look at them, you really have to look carefully when you're kind of doing these kind of analysis.
It's just a new term that hasn't been used before. The other thing is with Measure G, you mentioned the utility tax, and it is true that historically over the last utility tax that we had, and still have because it hasn't quite sunsetted, there was a specific earmark for 50% to the streets, and the rest of it would go to the general fund. Under the new reallocation of Measure G, that is no longer the case. All of the money will technically be available to the general fund. However, the council could choose to continue, either this council or some future council could continue to allocate half, 50-50 or some other proportion to streets or some other priority. Is that true?
I don't want to give you a legal opinion, but I think that would only relate to the UUT on telecommunications, so not on the other.
Yes, the Measure G portion, the Measure G allocation would be, but that's a piece of the UUT. So
That's
I
correct.
think we need to just be very clear with the public so they understand exactly what's going on. So, okay, thanks. The last thing is for Lori. These charts, as Mr. Armstrong says, you really have to burrow in, and this relates to the question that I asked earlier, and that is, I'm wondering, you have them all set out here, so it's very clear that you can see with this particular set of circumstances,
Right.
This is happening, this city has more of this, and this city has less of that. I'm wondering if there's a way, and this is a technical question maybe for IT, but to layer these city by city in different color codes so that we can see, in this city there's X type of population with this kind of median income, with this sort of general fund expense, blah, blah, blah. You get what I'm saying?
Right.
It's a different layering. I'm wondering if we could get that
Right.
just offline, not even in a report. It would make the analysis more, I think, thorough, at least for me.
So almost as if you were looking at each individual city in its own chart.
Exactly.
So
with
that you
the
could
various
look at-
different
right.
indicators within that city. So then with these and in a comparison with that sort of a layout,
Right.
I know that would help
Yeah, because you really
clarify
do,
my-
you have to, okay, this
Exactly.
is a larger city with a larger population or
Right.
a smaller city
Don't want to
with a
make
large.
more work for you. You've done a great job, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and the other community that also kind of has an interesting way of dealing with their infrastructure is Carlsbad, is that they have, I believe from the time that they set themselves up as a city, they established an infrastructure fund that they continually invest in each year, but it's not called out in their budget as coming from the general fund in that way. The next section, we're going to look at the 5 key tax revenues. And these 5 taxes represent approximately 63% of Santa Barbara's general fund revenue. And in the next chart, you kind of can get a feel for other communities and what that means for them as well. In looking at this information, what I did is I just stacked all the tax revenue all into one bar and then put in their revenue total, just to kind of see what portion of their revenue, general fund revenue, was made up of taxes. And in Santa Cruz, it represents only 53% of the monies that they receive. And in Carlsbad, it's 77% of their revenue stream. So those communities, again, just kind of a different impact when things change or taxes fluctuate. They may feel them differently than we do. And interesting, Santa Barbara has the same percentage as Santa Monica, even though Santa Monica is out on the far side with a much larger revenue stream. Their percentage is the same as ours when you look at it. So to look at them each individually, again, here's the general information on the sales tax revenue. When you start to look at it a little bit more, again, you have Redondo Beach sort of out at the far left at about $10 million, and Santa Barbara in the middle at about $21 million, and Santa Monica off on the right at about $33 million.
Lori, do we know anything about the comparative rates?
Yeah, I
percentages?
have a little information on some of the rates. For Santa Barbara, we're at 7.75 is our sales tax. And so Berkeley is the highest at 8.75, followed by Santa Cruz at 8.5, and then Redondo Beach, Santa Monica, and Sunnyvale are at 8.25, and Ventura is the lowest at 7.25. So there's a little bit of a range in there. So Santa Monica, not the highest, but again higher than what we're taking in. Property tax, again, a wide variety. Santa Cruz down on the far end, just at about 13 million, varying all the way up to Newport Beach at $73 million. And when you look
I had trouble with this this table when I was looking at it over the weekend, knowing that the property values here, the value per property is as high as any place on the chart, and realizing that you're talking about maybe gross volumes here, but how do we, is there a way of figuring out how it actually compares? I mean, is there a way of looking at the property values and seeing how that works on this chart?
Yeah, I didn't I didn't pull the information sort of on that median property value, but that would be potentially another way to get at looking at this information, is to look at the range that they're in comparison to us.
I mean, this is a one of the more startling graphs to me. I mean, just intuitively, I
That's
would
what I
have
thought too.
maybe put it on the other end, and to see it down here, you know, this is.
But I think
Well, and the thought,
when you
just to add on, the thought, we're looking at dollar amounts and not a percentage of how that relates to the full revenue source that we receive in the general fund. So it's kind of hard to see the comparison, sort of what Ms. Falcone was saying of having the city in relation to
All
its
its pieces.
population and everything else. When you look at numbers, it's hard to put it in context. So.
But I think this one with the per capita really does do an apples-to-apples comparison. And I think the thing to remember about property tax is after Prop 13 passed, when the legislature basically fixed the percentage of the pie that a city receives from the property tax. So if you had a low property tax rate in 1978 when Prop 13 was approved, you're penalized by the percentage of the pie you get in perpetuity now under Prop 13. And so I think that if you were to look, and we can get the assessed value data in those communities, I think you'd find that Santa Barbara probably would rate higher than a lot of these communities, but because we had a low tax rate in 1978, that's why our property tax revenue is down. And this one also, when I looked at it, I was just shocked as well, because you'd think, if nothing else, with the change in property, the number of property transactions, that we would have caught up. And this one was really surprising.
Do you think this also may imply that there's been less turnover of property here?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little, but I think it's more just that our rate was probably one of the lower ones back in 1978, and it just continues to be that we don't get much of the pie.
Right. Then we looked at business license tax information as well. A wide spectrum, again, of values of what each city is bringing in. And each of the cities has varying rates. Even the city of Santa Barbara has varying categories and rates and amounts, so it makes it hard to say, well, they have it set at this. And looking at per capita, Santa Monica's out there on the far right.
It would be interesting to see Santa Monica out there on the far left, which is what is usually the criticism.
Sorry. Pardon me. I had a little trouble with that. Then we, come on. Okay. Then we looked at utility users tax, and each of these are set by cities. There were 3 cities in this group that didn't have UUTs, and that was Newport Beach, Carlsbad, and Oceanside. This is 2008 data, so that reflects the current rate of 6%. The lowest amount that's charged is Sunnyvale at 2%, and the highest amount charged is Santa Monica at 10%. So, again, a varying range. But everybody else falls pretty much around as low 4.5 to 7 is the range of the rest of the group. So I'd say about 5% is where it's been hanging out with this group of cities. I'm sorry, I don't know how to make that one go away. And then you can look at it again as the per capita information based on the number of. Then we looked at transit occupancy tax. Santa Barbara and Berkeley are at 12%. Santa Monica is at 14%. And Sunnyvale is at 9.5%, while all the others are at 10%. So not quite as broad a range, but again, a variability in each of those communities.
Would you mind repeating those, Lori, please?
Sure. Santa Barbara and Berkeley are at 12, and then Santa Monica's at 14, Sunnyvale's at 9.5, and then all the rest are at 10%. So, based on population, again, a wide range of values coming in for per capita. Oceanside at $15, and Santa Barbara at $150, and then Carlsbad and Santa Monica at $373 per capita.
Is it possible to get the number of hotel rooms per city?
I'm sure their industries probably have some estimate, but I don't have those, so I can estimated rooms per each of those cities. Yeah, because that would help to fill out the rest of that. So in this group of 10 cities, there were quite a few that had redevelopment agencies. Newport Beach was the only one that didn't have one. And Santa Monica is unique in that they have a couple different project areas, and one of those areas also has some sub-areas in A and B. But their newest one was established after the Northridge earthquake and covers the damage that 90% of the buildings that were destroyed and 80% of the buildings that were damaged. And so those funds are going in for the redevelopment of that. And I thought that really reflected why their value was quite high in comparison. Berkeley on the far end is, one project area, 25 blocks, one staff member. a much smaller, much more focused redevelopment agency. And then Santa Barbara is just a little bit above the median there of this group at about 13 million annually. And again, just a wide variety of things that they're investing in their communities.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. The 13 million and these numbers, give a little more specificity as to 13 million a year. Is that the amount we receive? I mean, I know the answers to these questions, but if you would clarify. Is that the amount of tax increment we collect every year? Is the amount is that the average amount over the time that we have invested every year? Is that, break that down a little bit, because it's not specific here.
Okay, that is the funds that we receive as the city for our tax increment for the redevelopment agency. So in each of these budgets, it reflects the value that the cities are actually receiving instead of the total number.
Per year from their tax increment. Yeah. Okay, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Another way to sort of look at communities and evaluate ourselves against them is looking at the number of authorized positions in each community. Santa Barbara, per 1,000 residents, has 12 employees, which is a little on the higher end. The median in this group was about 6.8 positions per 1,000 residents. When you look at that, you need to consider also what kinds of services are being provided in those communities. Are there more enterprise funds that are involved? Is there a specific area where additional staffing is being provided? Do they have bigger departments, smaller departments? And what's the focus of those things? Are they providing a community program, sort of like our library system? We provide for our whole county area, whereas some of the other agencies are just providing for their city. So you just kind of need to really look at all of those elements and think about how that impacts that. So here's a graphic representation of that. Another area that we looked at was public safety, and how do we compare with other cities with law enforcement and fire protection. In the police area, we looked at three things: the police expenditure as a percent of the general fund expense, the number of sworn officers per 1,000 residents, and then Part 1 crimes. When looking at the percent of general funds, sorry about this. Not sure why that keeps coming up. It asks the question, are we funding appropriately? Are we exceeding in comparison with other areas? And in this graph and in this group of individual cities that we looked at, we're right in the median, and about 31% of our general fund is expended on police. What else? Santa Monica has a larger revenue stream, but they're only expending 27% of their revenue stream on their services. Some of these, also some other things to take into consideration when looking at this is the types of services that are included in that department as well, such as Santa Monica includes their harbor patrol in their police department. They have a helicopter unit, they have fleet service that they provide, they run an animal shelter. So each of these communities have little elements that they can pull in that slightly changes what that money is being spent on and why the values could vary. Berkeley includes their marine service and has jail service as well. And Huntington Beach operates a helicopter for their traffic operations.
We have a question, Lori.
Well, as far as Santa Monica is concerned, in that it's within not only the city of L.A., and it's surrounded on three sides at least by the city of L.A., and also there's a lot of county services and so forth. Do you think that might factor in to the percentage being so low, and that the actual patrols or whatever it is within the four corners of the city, there's so much else that bleeds in? Do you think that has any kind
It could potentially impact how that, and if there are other arrangements on how their services are provided, that could also, that wasn't
that wasn't part of your analysis?
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't go into,
Yeah.
but that could be an element of that.
But actually, when you see the staffing, they have very healthy staffing. I think what with Santa Monica is their general fund budget is so huge.
So huge.
It's all the other things they spend money on that most cities don't spend money on. So that's why theirs is a little strange, because when you see the staffing, theirs is the healthiest police staffing by far of any of the cities we
Yeah,
looked
but
at.
the percentage is really an anomaly
Yeah.
comparative to all the rest of the stuff, so maybe
Yeah.
they just spend it all on
Because they've got
lots
a
of lovely things.
$240 million general fund compared to our $100 million, and they're
Right.
about the same size as us.
Right, so that's a little bit, misleading. Okay, thank you.
And also in this, Sunnyvale is a unique community. I don't believe there are many nationwide even. They have a combined fire and police system. And so every police officer is a trained firefighter, and every firefighter is a trained police officer, as well as providing medical service, emergency medical service. They're not paramedics, but they do, my understanding is that they have their assigned position, and then they are trained as a secondary. So there are specified positions that are allocated to a police fund, and then there are positions that are allocated to their fire fund as well. So here's the per 1,000 residents. Again, the staffing is nice in Santa Monica at 2.36 per 1,000 residents. And Sunnyvale, again, because of their combined unit, I think it skews this number a little bit. Part 1, crimes, is another way to kind of look at information, but it's also one of those that can be kind of misleading. As I read into it, it is data that the FBI gathers and reports out on. They normally only report out on communities that are 100,000 plus. Each community kind of, even though there's a standard, probably some variability about the types of crimes that are committed by communities. Some are extremely sensitive, others may put up with more than another community. So this is just kind of a usual stick that people look at. We're right around the middle. So just kind of, we'll move on to fire. We looked at fire in 4 different ways. Again, the percentage general fund expense, number of sworn personnel, number of fire stations, and then the number of square miles covered by our fire station. And those kind of, the last 2 hopefully provide a little more information about how they're providing their coverage in their community. Oh, and I'm sorry, we also have the number of fire calls and medical emergency calls. Here's the fire expenditures across the board here. Santa Barbara's right at 17.1%. Pardon me here for a second.
So can you go back to Sunnyvale then, if every police officer is also trained as a firefighter, and you have 16% there, and then you had a different number under police? I mean, are
Right.
you supposed to add them up?
They have it-
And how did they delineate between police and fire if it's the same department?
They have a total of 210 authorized positions, and then of that, 129 are police officers, and then 81 are fire personnel. So that's how they break out. Their primary duty is a police officer, but they are trained, so the ratio is different. It's not half and a half. So, also, when we're looking at our percentage of general fund expense, we did exclude the airport services from this, as that's funded by the airport, so that didn't skew this statistic. Other things that kind of affected the communities, I think, and the amounts of monies that are available in those departments are, there's communities that have a service called FireMed, and residents can buy a service, basically. They pay an annual fee, and what that guarantees them is free ambulance service, medical calls, and things like that. So you kind of pay up front, and then anytime you need their service, it would be free for medical type emergencies. So I can see that that might have an impact on how things and funds would be available and what kinds of things they could do with them. Here is the fire personnel per 1,000. Again, as low as 0.59 in Sunnyvale, but with the the ability to have dual coverage, I think that does skew the statistics. Santa Barbara is right out there at 1, Newport Beach at 1.5 fire personnel per 1,000 residents. Here are the square miles covered by a station. I skipped over the number of stations, I'm sorry. But it kind of helps you to see in the communities there were as little as 3 fire stations and as many as 6, I believe. I'm sorry, I don't remember. But this kind of helps to see what their service areas are and how much area a fire station needs to cover. You also, elements in there that you might want to consider when looking at this is the layout of the city, the topography, the accessibility within the city. Carlsbad, has got quite a range that they're covering in each, on an average, 7 square miles, which is quite, yeah. So, good information just to look at, what kinds of things are, and Berkeley down there, 1.5 square miles is, but they're not a huge community, so. Number of fire calls. What was interesting to me is that the number of fire calls is significantly less than the number of medical emergency calls. And I think in this data, I think there's some variability in how people are calling out their data and reporting it, just because it's such a wide range. We talked to a couple different people in Santa Monica, and it was 46 fires. And that is all they have in a year. And so... but then you have Sunnyvale on the other side with over 1,000, almost 2,000 fire calls. So I think there's some variability in the communities as how they're logging that information. And medical emergency calls, we really tried to get just those that were medical emergency calls as opposed to calls for hazardous materials and other things, because most of the communities provide that service as well through their fire departments. But I think Huntington Beach has more in there than just medical calls at this point. And Carlsbad, the most current data that we could get for them was 2005, 2006. There wasn't anything more current that was available to us. The next area we looked at was the library, and focused on 3, in this PowerPoint, I focused on the 3 areas: the operating budget, the number of facilities, and the library circulation. In this area, it's a little bit harder to do an exact comparison because only 2 of the communities actually, us and Santa Cruz, function in the same way. We provide countywide services, and everybody else is truly just a city service. And so the community and population that they're servicing is much broader than just their population base.
Question here, Gloria.
It's just a clarification. We do provide for a very large area that is outside of the city all the way up into the valley, if I understand correctly. Not Carpinteria, though. It's my understanding that Carp has its own district. But everything from Carpinteria up through the valley, we do service.
Right.
However, there is an arrangement of contribution from a number of the jurisdictions, and I think that needs to be just put into the mix so that the analysis is very clear that, yes, we service this, but it's not that we're paying for 100% of the district. So just to be clear for folks, we're not carrying the load of Goleta or Solvang or whatever it happens to be.
Right, and Santa Cruz has the same kind of, they actually have a joint power, a JPA, a joint powers agreement.
Yeah, a JPA,
that
Santa Cruz
they've
does,
actually, set up. So again, everybody's paying in, but in the data that you received on the graphs, there's a per capita chart in there, and that it doesn't reflect accurately the communities that they're really servicing, that they're really doing much more than just their little local community, and so it kind of skewed the numbers in that one. The other thing when looking at their operating budgets, unique things were going on here as well. Newport Beach, one of their largest branches, is shared with a school. And so the school has basically the library during school hours, and then the library becomes available to the community after school is out. So it's an arrangement that they share, which I think also affects how they fund things, as well as the kinds of circulation rates that they've got. Berkeley has a library tax, and so basically they have no general fund revenue going in for their library operating expenses. And in fact, this year they just approved another measure, bond, to upgrade their branches to make them accessible and seismic, and so they've got a community where they're already supporting themselves through their own tax, although they've had struggles in actually meeting and performing within the funds that were being generated by the tax. And so I read in some of their budget documents that they were actually having a deficit. So with their new bond, it's about $27 a year per homeowner that will go into investing into the rehab. I did not find an actual dollar value of what that bond was going to be that they were putting out there. The other thing that's unique about Berkeley is they have a tool library, and you can go and borrow tools. We're talking saws, hammers, and it's run through their library department. And it was, I guess, originally set up for low-income community, and then at some point they got the funding and made it's free to anyone who is a library customer, and it's a very active part of their library system. So that was really unique to find out about in other communities. And here, this is kind of where you can see that Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz, with the number of facilities that they're operating, which also includes our bookmobile. The data that I gathered this from is a statewide library database that annually every library submits their data, and they're categorized by the range of population, and all of this data is collected and then reported out each year to each library so that they can look at it and analyze it. And Sunnyvale has one facility that's serving 138,000 residents, which makes it one of the state's busiest libraries. That's what they report out. Again, like I said, Newport Beach does share one of their facilities with a school. Circulation rate just kind of gives you an idea of how the community is using their library and the materials that they offer. Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz, according to the data that they're categorized in, they have a range of somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 that they're servicing. So, if we're servicing 210,000 people, we're in that giant range. So it does fluctuate, whereas you look at the smallest community was 40,000 to 60,000. But again, it's data that they keep and break down in that range. So now we'll move on to parks. Just another community, sort of showing a community focus in an area where cities are investing their funds. It was a little bit hard to compare parks and recreation because not each of these communities had their parks and recreation set up in that way. Some actually had a cultural or a community service department, and then that was broken down into other things. And so in this one, we just purely looked at the number of parks, acreage, and types of parks that they offer, just sort of as a way to gauge what's going on in the community. Santa Barbara has an average of 6.4 acres per 1,000 residents, and Santa Cruz has 9.21. And this is only developed parks. Most of the communities reported out their information between developed and undeveloped parks. Santa Barbara has an additional 1,200 acres that's not shown in here that are available in the community for people to go and visit and use. And so I think that kind of reflects on our outdoor enjoyment and our encouragement of our community to use those natural resources. Another area of sort of sustainability and green elements or the solid waste diversion rates. Right now, my understanding is the requirement is that you're supposed to have a 50% diversion rate from your 1990 waste stream. And as you can see on here, a couple of the communities are still struggling. And the other thing that's really interesting about this is statewide data that is maintained, but even the 2006 data that I'm showing here is uncertified. They're not considering it to be official until, and I don't know when it becomes certified data, but it's out there and people can look at it and pull it from the web.
Did you get it from the Solid Waste Board?
Yeah.
The State Solid
Yeah,
Waste Board?
state.
Integrated Solid Waste Board. Okay.
Yeah. And the other thing that was kind of interesting is that Redondo Beach, I wasn't able to extract them out as a community by themselves. They are aggregated with a larger community down there, and they don't report out separately. And in 2006, we were at 66%, and I believe our new rate is 68%. So we continue to move forward in this area.
Uncertified rate.
Yeah, uncertified. So, another element that each of the communities had available and we could go and look at, and I think helps understand where some of the funds in the community goes, street pavement condition index and lane miles, kind of the area where you're investing in. Here's what each of the communities were reporting out. Redondo Beach with about 127 lane miles that they maintain, Santa Barbara with 280, and then Huntington Beach said 1,121. But when talking with staff, they include their freeway miles. I'm not sure why they do that, but that's how they report out their information. So I think there's a little variability in here as well. And you kind of need to look again, sort of like you said, at that snapshot of the whole community. And if you're looking at how many square miles they're really covering, then you can see that 1,000 seems a bit extreme. Kind of tied in with that is the PCI, the Pavement Condition Index. Again, it's a standardized type thing and is reported out usually in an official report. But even with that, there's some variability from one community to the next as how they rate different types of things. And so in Santa Barbara, we are currently at around 70. We've gone a little bit higher. We've dropped back a little bit. But we're much higher than we used to be because of our choice in street funding. And so we made that a priority, and we've really brought it up. I believe that originally we were somewhere just below 60. And now we're really holding steady at about 70. So, and I think that helps the community. You know, that's one of those things that you'll hear about first is when the streets fall apart. So in summary, this is just information to kind of start looking at how we compare with communities, these 10 in particular. You do need to dig a little bit more if there's more information in order to make an exact comparison between one group and the next. But overall, in this group of 10 cities, Santa Barbara was right about the median.
What I got out of it, first of all, I want to thank you for the effort, because you and I have been working on this for a while now, and I think you did a really fine job in bringing it forward. It doesn't, you know, it's not like a set of rules, or you must do this, you must have these kind of numbers. It's more of a big snapshot of what's going on. And when you look at this report as a whole, you know, there's a couple of surprising things that we've pointed out, and it would be interesting, for example, to go back and look into that property value thing a little bit more and see if we can derive something. And it may well be that the rates were low when Prop 13 happened, but that one was surprising. The other ones were pretty much about where I thought we'd be. And one thing you get out of a report like this, which I've done most of my life, is if you start whatever organization you're with appearing on the outer ends of this kind of a study in either way, then you begin to wonder why.
Right.
And in our case, we we seem to be pretty much around the average, which doesn't necessarily mean that's good or bad. It just is. But it does give you a little sense of confidence about where we are compared to our counterparts, and in answering questions for people that come here and wonder how things are going. So I think it's a great report. Other comments? Yeah.
I'll start over. I won't leave the compliments lying in the ether. Thank you, Lori. Thank you very, very much. I know this took a tremendous amount of work to ferret out all of the various different pieces of information from all of the diverse cities, and then to try to get as many apples to apples comparisons as you could within the fact that each city is so unique. And having worked for 7 years at the league level, at the state level, it's so interesting that when people say, well, this city does it this way and that city does it that way, when you get in underneath the sort of rudimentary layer of the analysis, you see all the various different nuances about how cities actually do what's best for them. That's why I really would like to have that layered approach. And if you could give me a copy in color so I can see the various bands. We do try to save money and not print anything in color unless absolutely necessary. But for this purpose, there are layers that are color-coded that mean things. And I'd like to go into the more sophisticated sort of more detailed analysis. And not only for comparisons, not only just to see where we are in the scheme of these comparable cities, but also to see what the other cities are doing and to understand maybe a little bit more why certain communities are behaving in certain ways and what can we learn from that in order to benefit us going forward. So I think that there are things that we can learn on a whole host of levels, and I'd like to look at some of that and maybe just go into it a little more deeply, whether that's an additional report after some questions, I don't know, or whether or not it's just me offline getting more educated about how to go forward in a better way. So thank you, Lori. I really appreciate it very much.
Eileen?
Thank you. Also want to echo my appreciation and gratitude, and I think this will be helpful for us and the rest of the council as we look at budgetary issues in the next few months. One thing that also came to mind, and I don't know if it's possible to look at this or not in terms of getting accurate data. When we talk about population, you're talking about, I think now, 2000 census data, or are you looking at anything sooner than that? What's the
data that I got for the population that I used as the overall was from the state finance department.
Okay.
So it
And
was
how old
current.
It is current.
But
so that's about residents, and the other thing that might differ from city to city is the influx or outflow of population. So, for example, we have thousands of people from other cities come here to work, which would then impact the number of police officers per people in town during the day. Yeah, instead of by 1,000 residents, it would also change the number of Part 1 crimes per 1,000 because that rate would go up. Oceanside, as another example, is the opposite, where that's a more bedroom community where people commute out of the city during the day and then come back. So how that then reflects on services, I think, that's also additional information that might be helpful. I don't know if that's possible to get that kind of information as accurate. Again, it all depends on how people report things. I think Mr. Horton's right. When we look at the outliers, if we ever found ourselves at the very low or at the very high end, then we ask the question about how did we get to that point. So I too appreciate it, and it's a good tool to have as we move forward with all the questions we're going to have on the budget in the next few months.
I was just thinking about the enterprise funds, and in their recent financial reviews of the airport, there's a lot of data in those finance reports that we looked at here in this meeting a few weeks back, showing the volume of airports, number of passengers and things like that. And that could easily be added to a report like this. It's not quite the same type of thing you're doing, but it does show how our airport stacks up with other smaller airports. I don't know if there's anything comparable for the other enterprise funds, like the the Harbor Department or anything like that. But it might be worth to take a look at it. Anyway, so that's our agenda today. Unless someone is invisible in the back, I don't see any public comment. But now would be the time. And if not, then we're going to adjourn the meeting.